Okay, so welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the session, Dr. Robert Yang, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, with joint appointments in electrical engineering and the Schwarzman College of Computing. He is also an associate member of the MIT McGovern Institute, where his research focuses on building neural networks and circuit models of brain functions. So Robert originally trained in physics at Peking University, and then went on to obtain a PhD in computational neuroscience at NYU with Xiaojing Wang. This was followed by an internship in software engineering at Google Brain, and then he conducted postdoctoral research at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at Columbia University, where he was a junior fellow at the Simon Society of Fellows. His current lab at MIT focuses on building multi-scale, multi-system integrative models of higher cognitive functions, where he's made important contributions to the use of recurrent neural networks as a modeling tool in neuroscience, and has also shed important light on the neural mechanisms for cognitive flexibility. So it's my pleasure to welcome Robert to speak here today. His talk is entitled Next Generation Recurrent Network Models for Cognitive Neuroscience.
Thank you, Andrea, for the kind introduction. So let me share a screen. So you can see the screen all right? Is it good? Because I can't see anything.
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
Yep, it looks great.
So unfortunately, I wasn't able to set up the iPad on the other side so I can see people and see the questions. So I apologize. So today I give this talk about next generation RNN models for cognitive neuroscience. It's really an opinion piece. So I'll be mixing opinion and like facts, and I'll try to let you all know when it's an opinion. So I'm very happy to be giving a talk at Montreal AI and Neuroscience, and really hope that I really wish I could give this in person, because I actually spent 5 years living in Montreal when I was a little kid. And also I'm very happy to be following Jean-Remy because we met like more than 10 years ago at this computational cognitive neuroscience summer school. So one thing I want to say about Jean-Remy's talk is that he mentioned that it's very hard to build one-to-one mapping between artificial and biological neurons. So we actually have a recent paper show that at least when artificial networks are modeling fruit fly olfactory system, you can build almost one-to-one mapping. So but I'm not going to talk about this work today. Okay. So I don't really need to convince you all why artificial neural networks are cool and why they can help us understand the brain and minds. But if you are interested, we have a little primer, and you can check it out, where we introduce some of these ideas. And so, of course, neural networks can be used as data analysis tools, but for computational modelers like me, they're also very important because they can use to model complex behavior, model complex activity, and they can help us understand the why question that Jean-Remy also mentioned that is very hard, right? So it gives us optimization perspective, or some people call it deep learning perspective, right? It helps us understand the neural system the same way, or in a similar way that evolution theory help us understand the biological world. Okay, but today I will focus on talking about recurrent neural networks and its impact on cognitive neuroscience. So this line of study really has a long history, like many things in neural networks, dating back like 20 years. But there's a recent revival thanks to deep learning. It's really led by or ignited by David Susilo. So I will use his paper to showcase the classical paradigm of RNN for cognitive neuroscience. So usually you start with a single task, and it's usually a cognitive task that people have already trained animals to do. And then you would train a simple recurrent neural network. It can be something like a vanilla recurrent network, and you would train it on some simplified version of the cognitive task. And then you would train it with some version of gradient-based method using backpropagation. Now, importantly, you would do some clever analysis of the model, right? So you would look at representation and dynamics. So for example, you can do this on the recurrent network. So this is a very specific hypothesis-driven state space analysis. And then you can do the same thing with data from, for example, prefrontal cortex in animals. And then you can make a decision whether or not, like, what does this tell us? Do we learn anything from this? So I forgot to say that I apologize because I apologize in advance because I'll be talking about many different papers. So for each paper, I won't go into a lot of details, and so I just want to apologize in advance. And back in 2016, together with Francis Sun and Xiaojing, we also did some work using this classical paradigm, kind of playing this game for several classical cognitive tasks that people have studied, training a network to do one task, doing some clever analysis, and then comparing with the brain. And for the most part, we can reproduce what people have found. So that's pretty fun. And then you can also do it when the network is trained with reinforcement learning, not supervised learning. And so this has been fun. But today I want to try to convince you that we need to move beyond this classical paradigm. And of course, there are the usual criticism against using neural networks, right? So there's interpretability, there's the back propagation is not realistic. So all of these are fair things, right? But I want to talk about the problem specific to using RNN models for cognitive neuroscience. So one thing is cognition really involves a wide range of brain areas and cortical and subcortical areas. So using a single area RNN just really doesn't do justice to the complexity. And then cognition is also very flexible. I mean, you can argue that's a hallmark of cognition. But when you train an RNN to do just one task, it's not flexible anymore. It can only do that one task. And learning of lab tasks, especially in humans, but also in other animals, rely on existing circuitry. So they don't just come in with some random network that get trained. And I hope to show you that this matters even when we study animals. This is especially important for when we study humans. So this is my opinion of how we should move beyond this classical paradigm. And you can also find a little bit more in this little opinion piece that I wrote together with Manuel Milano Mazon. So the first generation of these RNN models can be described single task, single network, and backprop. And hopefully in the future, we would move towards more naturalistic cognition. We would have multiple areas, cell types, etc., and biological learning and plasticity rules. And today I want to show you some examples of how we can take some baby steps towards this goal. So I want to lead by saying that I think the main challenge is not engineering. So there's a lot of, if you model human AI, right, engineering is very, very important. But for animal level cognition, the networks we can build nowadays, they already far surpass the capability of cognitive capability of animals, or at least in many, many ways. So I just want to give you an example. So this is, just this little work we did when I was at Google with David Cicillo and Igor Ganevchev and folks. And we built this multi-area model that has, like vision, language, some short-term memory, some controller that sends all sorts of attention to guide the activation in early areas. And it can do things that were considered pretty fancy back then in 2017, where you can answer, look at a complex picture like this and answer some natural language questions. So this is already way beyond what any animal can be trained to do, right? But many scientific questions are answered, right? We're not just done with multi-area models. For example, how to capture the diversity across brain areas with a few principles, right? And how to meaningfully map RNN areas to brain areas. how to evaluate multi-area models across many experimental data sets. How should multi-areas model be trained, right? When you have many areas, should we still train them end to end? So there are many questions like that that are still unanswered, especially if we want to understand the brain. And it might seem like I'm just advocating that we should put everything we know about biology into the network, but that's really not the goal. We're not trying to, build an extremely detailed replica of the brain. So what we should do is to gain understanding, right? So we should understand how biological elements serve functions, and hopefully I can show you what we mean. I'll show you what I mean by that. So first, I want to start going beyond single cognitive task. I was showing you this slightly older work about training a network to do multiple tasks. Of course, prefrontal cortex is very important for many cognitive tasks. It's not used in just one task. And so one question is, how does the same circuit perform many tasks? And with the neural network, you can just you can ask this question, and we really don't know the answer. So we came up with some hypotheses. So one axis that is possible is this axis of clustering. So essentially, each circle here is a neuron, and then the color indicates whether or not the neuron is engaged more in task 1 or task 2. And you can have very low clustering, which means all the neurons are kind of more or less engaged in each task, or you can have very, very extreme clustering where each task is supported by a private group of neurons. And of course, you can also have other axes, for example, compositionality. And if you combine compositionality and clustering, then you can see something interesting. For example, the shared computation between two tasks may be supported by a shared population, but then they also have some separate populations. So we really don't know what it's like in the brain. And so we can first test what it's like in a neural network. So we trained a little recurrent neural network to do many cognitive tasks, and we have very simplified input that nevertheless allow us to essentially code up many cognitive tasks that people have studied with animals, especially monkeys. So they involve memory-guided saccade, parametric working memory, perceptual decision-making, and so on and so on. And the network is trained with, it's a vanilla recurrent network, and it's trained with stochastic gradient descent, so just simple basic stuff. And importantly, all the tasks are randomly interleaved during training. And so you can think of it as they're not trying to do all of these tasks at the same time, but they're really learning them back and forth. So this is joint work with Mehdi Jalkar, Francis Son, Bill Nilsson, and Xiaojing. And what we want to do is test this hypothesis. So we need a way to, for example, measure the engagement of a neuron in each task. And so we came up with this little measure called task variance. That, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go in detail. So essentially, if the task variance is high, that means the neuron is really kind of involved in a task in a very broadly defined manner. And what I will show you here is how individual neuron is engaged across these 20 tasks. And so what you can see here is there is clear structure. Of course, it's we sorted it, but the structure is real. So there are functional modules that emerge in the network, especially if you look at, for example, this module, right? So these are a bunch of neurons that are all engaged in this set of tasks. So I didn't tell you these tasks, but these are all tasks that involve some working memory and decision making. So this is just neural activity representation, but we can also show that these clusters are causally related to task performance. So you can lesion one cluster at a time, and what you can see is there's a pretty tight correspondence between the cluster you lesion and the task. So essentially the task variance and the task that where the performance drop if you lesion this cluster. So we can draw essentially a conclusion, or at least a hypothesis, that each cluster is specialized to one cognitive process, and then performing. Now, importantly, each cluster is involved in many tasks, and each task can involve multiple clusters, right? So performing one task really amounts to flexibly engaging relevant clusters. Now, the nice thing about training a network on these cognitive tasks that people have data on is that we can go back and check if our findings are similar to what people have found in the brain. So no one has trained an animal to do so many tasks, but people have trained animals to do these two particular tasks. So this turns out is the same task that David Sosello studied, that Valeria Monte recorded. So here animals is like looking at this colored random dot, and in one task has to decide whether or not the dots are moving left or right. Another task has to decide whether or not the dots are more green or more red. And what we did is we looked at whether or not individual neurons are more involved in one task or another task, and we plot the distribution. So here you can see that you have a group of neurons that is really involved in both tasks, right? This corresponds to this cluster, and another group that is only involved in context DM1, another group that is only involved in context DM2. And we can do the same analysis in prefrontal data recorded from monkeys doing this task. And to our surprise, it's really different. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand why this is different. And so one hypothesis we had is the neural network is trained to do all of these tasks, and it's interleaved, but the brain really is working under a different different assumption, right? The brain, when a monkey learns some task, it cannot just rewire its entire brain to learn it. It's learning in a continual fashion, and it has to be able to retain previously learned information and not completely overwrite them. So many continual learning methods rely on this insight. And for example, this work from Friedman Zenke, who's I think in the audience, essentially introduced a continual learning method where they protect synapses that are important for previously learned tasks. And we use this method and trained the recurrent network sequentially. And then you can see, for example, this method really improves the performance. So this is the performance when looked at the end of sequential training. And the earlier learned task, the performance is much better. Now, and what is interesting is when we do that and we look at this how neurons are engaged in these two tasks, we see a much closer match to data. So this, of course, is not approved, but this suggests that maybe the brain is really working under different assumptions from neural networks that are trained directly to perform a task, and we should look more into realistic assumptions like continual learning. Just real quick, so you can find these tasks packaged more nicely in this Neurogym GitHub repo. Okay, so following up on what I mentioned earlier about it's unrealistic to just train a network directly on the task and hope to get very biological solutions. People have argued, and I really think this is important, that we need to take into account of the effect of evolution and development, which carve the neural circuit at fundamentally different timescales and also in fundamentally different ways. Right? So evolution changed your gene, it doesn't change your synaptic ways directly. And then once we have networks that are evolved and developed, then we can train them on that task. And in this way, we can hopefully get more realistic solutions and better match to the brain. So this is really, so here, I just want to show you in this case study that even when you're not studying humans, this matters. So here, our collaborators, Jaime de la Rocha, and they recorded data from rats performing this two alternative forced choice tasks. Now, the details don't matter so much. The important thing is there are 2 blocks, and each block, in one block, you need to keep repeating. So that's the right thing. Keep repeating the choice. And another block, you should keep alternating. And as you can see, so what the red do is what you would expect. In the repeating block, it tends to repeat more than in the alternating block. Now, what is strange is if the red makes a single mistake, right? In one trial, it's not rewarded, then it immediately gives up this preference, which is really counterintuitive because an arrow shouldn't just erase whatever information that you had about the block before. Nevertheless, the red does this strange thing. And so we can quantify this with a reset index, and the closer to 1 means that it's giving up on what it has learned about the block information. And if you train RNN directly on this task, it doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't reset. And a potential explanation that why the rats are doing this, but the RNN is not doing this, is that in natural environment, corrects and arrows are not equally informative. So if you get it correct, it's telling you that you can keep doing what you have been doing. But if you get an arrow, it's only telling you that that what you are doing is wrong. It's not telling you what's the next thing to do. So in a way that maybe the rat is just going in an exploration mode because it doesn't really know what it's supposed to do. So it's temporarily giving up on the information that it has accumulated. So to test this hypothesis, we pre-train a network on an AFC task. So this is a task where it's also simple, but it has many more alternatives, not just 2 alternatives. And then we train it on the lab task. And so if you do this pre-training first, then the behavior is a lot closer to animal. Now, this is not a general recipe of how we should pre-train networks, but I think this is just one piece of evidence showing that even when we study animals, it's perhaps important to think about the right way to pre-train them. Next, I want to tell you a little bit about how to go beyond backpropagation and incorporate more biological learning and plasticity rules. So there's a very important line of research that shows that backpropagation in at least in feed-forward network, but also in recurrent network, can be approximated with biological learning rules and biological plasticity rules. So today I'm not going to talk about that. I will show you how biological plasticity rules can complement backpropagation. And I will talk about 3 stories that use a short-term plasticity, anti-heavy and long-term plasticity, and non-heavy and 3-factor plasticity. So short-term memory is very important for us, and people have been discussing the neuromechanism for short-term plasticity. So there are different hypotheses. Some people have proposed that it's more based on persistent activity. So you have some neurons that keep firing in your brain, but then other people have suggested that maybe it's supported by synaptic plasticity. So once you have seen something, it enhances, for example, some synaptic weights in your brain for a short amount of time, and then when you want to remember it, you can just activate all the neurons. And because some synaptic weights have been enhanced, it would retrieve the stored pattern. And of course, these 2 hypotheses are not exclusive, so it can be both. But it's kind of unsatisfying to just say, okay, it just can be both. So we want to understand when the network is using persistent activity more and when it's probably relying on synaptic plasticity more to store short-term memory. So our hypothesis is that short-term memory or working memory is active, which means it uses more persistent activity when it needs to be manipulated, because you can more easily manipulate neural activity than you can manipulate essentially plastic synaptic weights. And what we did, and by we, I mean Nick Mas. So this is collaboration with Dave Friedman and Nick Mas really did like 95% of the work here. So So what we did is introduce RNN with short-term plasticity in it. It also happens to be EI network, excitatory inhibitory RNN, and we would train them on various working memory tasks. And importantly, to test our hypothesis that manipulation is important, we would train them on tasks that requires different levels of manipulation. So what do I mean by that? So for example, you can look at the simple delay match to sample task where you see a stimulus, there's a delay, and then you see another stimulus, and you have to tell whether or not they're the same. So so you can imagine you don't need to really manipulate the sample stimulus that you saw in the first place. But in this delayed match to rotated sample task, you see a sample and then you see a test, but you have to tell whether or not the sample after rotated 90 degree is same as a test. Okay? So you can imagine you have to do something, maybe like mental rotation. You don't have to do that, but it just feels like that this task requires more manipulation. And so what we did is train the network to do these tasks, and then we would quantify how much the network is relying on persistent activity versus synaptic plasticity. And we can do that because we have access to all variables in this recurrent network. And what we see is really there's a very strong correlation between the level of manipulation in the task. So we had to come up with an operational definition, and I welcome you to check the paper, with the amount of persistent neural activity that is used. So this is really showing that the more persistent activity, the more manipulation that you need in the task, the more the network is relying on persistent neural activity. Okay, so this is a story about short-term plasticity. I want to tell you another more recent story about kind of medium-term or long-term plasticity. So this is joint work with Dan Chimankov and Larry Abbott, and again, Dan did like 95% of all the work here. So here, what we did is look at a continual familiarity detection task. So this is essentially, as you live your life, you can see something and you can tell whether or not you have seen it before. We are very, very good at that, very, very high capacity. And we do that all the time. We don't even notice that we're doing it. And so we train a network to do a simplified version of this task where it sees a bunch of vectors, one vector at each time point. And importantly, we can control whether or not, if there is a repeat, what is the interval? For example, here we call this interval R, which means if there's a repeat, so this is a familiar stimulus, it's always it has been first shown like R time steps ago. Now, we have this simple task and we can train a recurrent network to do it. So recurrent network can, if you train it, for example, on a training set of where R train is 3, and then you test it on R of different levels, you can see that it can do perfectly the R that it has been trained on, but it doesn't generalize at all to any other Rs. And that's that's true for R train equals to 6. And so that's of course troubling. And then you can always say, I'm going to train it with more R, and so we showed that it doesn't even interpolate that well. And from neuroscience, we know that this task probably involves plasticity, right? It's not done with a recurrent neural network. And so what we did is just looking at, in this case, a feed-forward network. I'm sorry, this is no longer a recurrent network. So we looked at a feed-forward network, but with plastic weights. So this network has the input and the hidden layer, and the input to hidden connectivity consists of 2 parts. So one is this plastic part that is going through some plasticity, and importantly, the plasticity rule is being meta-learned, which means so we parameterize the plasticity, we write down the parameters, and we use gradient descent to change these parameters of the plasticity rule. Now, importantly, there's another part. It's a fixed weight matrix, and this matrix is meta-learned as well. Now, what this matrix does is not just simply just hanging out there. It is determining the address of plasticity. So usually we don't really think about this, right? When we think about synaptic plasticity, it's fire together and wire together. So if neurons are firing together, then that is where the plasticity will happen. But here we have another synaptic weight matrix that can help control where the plasticity is happening. So the network has to, the meta learning has to learn both how the plasticity will happen, right? The plasticity rule, and also where it will happen. So that's the address. And I won't go into a lot of details, but essentially what we found is the plasticity rule emerged to be anti-Hebbian, which means if you wire together, you connect less together, right? So you hate each other. Which is similar to what people have suggested in previous models. And you can see there's very, very natural generalization. So you can train it on R train equals to 3 here, and it would generalize to many different levels of R test. And you can notice that the x-axis is all different from the x-axis above. So this is an example where if you have the right biological plasticity rules, it really can lead to just profoundly different solutions to some very important functions that we need every day. So finally, I want to talk about this work also together with Dan Shumenkov, but also with Ching Fan and Aparna Vadapati, where we looked at long-term memory, and the classical model for long-term memory or long-term episodic memory, where you can store explicit experience and retrieve it, right? So here it's important that you can retrieve the experience. So the classical model for that is Hopfield network in neuroscience. But in machine learning, people have been looking at more these key value memory networks. And so you can think of it as you just have these slots, and then each slot you can store a key vector and then a value vector, and then you can have a query that comes in and get compared to all the keys, get matched to the most similar key, and then the similar value vector would get retrieved. The corresponding value vector would get retrieved. Right? So this is also very similar to the attention mechanism in machine learning. And so there's a pretty straightforward correspondence between a key value memory and a neural network. So you can say, okay, I have some neurons coming in that represent a query, and then these synaptic weights would represent the key matrix, and these synaptic weights would represent the value matrix, and this hidden layer would represent how well the query matches individual key vector. And so people have already pointed out this mapping between neural network and a key value memory network. What was unknown is whether or not there is a biological plasticity rule to it. And what we showed in this paper is essentially yes, but it's not a classical Hebbian plasticity. It's a 3-factor non-Hebbian synaptic plasticity rule. So essentially, you have this feed-forward network. Initially, no weights. There's no information in the weights, and then you have the query comes in, and importantly, each neuron not only has its activity, but it also has another additional variable that determines, again, whether or not the plasticity happens at all. So this you can think of as dendritic spike or dendritic plateau potential in real biological neurons. And then, for example, these third factors can randomly select some neurons, and then they will lead to plasticity in the synapses connecting the input to this selected neuron, and this will write the key, right? So you see there's a one-to-one correspondence between the query and the key here. And then using now the input would drive this neuron, and then through simple Hebbian plasticity, you can write the value. So you can write connect the information to the value matrix. So this is a simple mechanism, but what it shows is that the key value memory network people have used in machine learning really can be pretty biological. And in fact, even this plasticity rule has been observed in hippocampus, and people just haven't made the connection yet. And compared to Hopfield network, this sort of key value memory network has the advantage that the memories can be manipulated more independently. And there is a bunch of implication about that I encourage you to check out in our paper. Okay, so I will finish by some discussion about how should we build next generation RNN models with a particular style. So again, it's not so much about just engineering, and it's not so much about just putting biology. So this is, again, my opinion. I think one thing that's very important is that we need to be continue to be committed to functions. So it's easy to put in some biological elements into the network that really hurts the functions. And I think in many cases that's not worth it. So if we put in some biological elements, we should understand how it may help the functions, not just put them in because they're there. And I'm a neuroscientist. I very much care about understanding the brain. And I think it's really important when we do this business that we stay close to experimental data, and they can provide us really important insight, and especially neuroactivity and connectivity data that is, I think, sometimes ignored when people think like primarily about behavior. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize both quantitative metrics, which allow us to do very high throughput comparison, but also intellectual insights. So we have to be able to communicate what we learned from training these networks and comparing them with the brain. So I'll finish by thanking the people who are involved in this work. I mean, most of this work are done by other people that I just merely provided some ideas, and I'm privileged to be able to tell you about their work. So Dan Chumankov, Ching Fan, Francis San Xiaojing, Manuel Morano, Nick Mas, and David Susello. So these are the people that whose work I talked about today. What I didn't get to tell you is a work. I'm very excited about the work that we're doing in our new group here. Our little group is called Metaconscious Lab. And yeah, and hopefully in the future, not too far away, I'll be able to tell you about what we're doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert,
Yeah.
for an excellent talk and many very interesting insights. So I think there's some questions.
All right, I'll field some questions.
So is it okay if I just read the question? Is that okay?
Well, I can do it. It's okay. I'll read the question. There were two questions that were very popular, but I'm going to start with the one that I think is more closely related to the actual content of your talk, which was posted by Vail Borghesani, who asks, how would you add to the picture evolution, the fact that vision came before language, for example, and development, that spoken language comes before written language, into the picture? Arguably, the brain generalized from one task to another, recycling computations that were already available. And then perhaps a related question from Zilong Wang. I wonder how we can introduce development into structural change in the neural network, presumably corresponding to biological changes in the brain.
Yeah. So these are great questions. Thank you for asking them. And I don't have the answers. If I knew, I would probably have done it. I think it's, so today I just want to say that I think it's really important for us to think about this, but I don't really know what's the right way for us to include evolution and development. And I think at least one thing that a start is to look at different ways to train the network, and also having different algorithms change different type of information. For example, I know Tony Zader has this work where a neural network where evolution is really changing this like kind of gene, and then which is then expressed into a neural network. So I think thinking along these lines are pretty cool. Again, I don't have the I don't have the answer, and I hope as a field we'll try to figure that out. But of course, I just want to say we don't have to be so extreme and say, okay, we want to simulate evolution with evolutionary algorithm, right? So I think it's still possible to do a lot of things with, for example, gradient descent. You can do meta learning with gradient descent and use that to simulate evolution. So this one work we did with our factory system is essentially along that line.
Okay, well, there was some more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I think we're gonna just have to say thank you for raising all these excellent and interesting points.
Yes, thank you for the great insights.
Yep, thank you very much. All right, well, with that we'll go on and move on to the next speaker. Thanks again, Robert.